Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we explore tales that reveal the power of humility, grace, and unexpected lessons. Today's story follows a shocking encounter at 30,000 feet, a moment of prejudice and an even more powerful response. What happens when a passenger makes a quick judgment about the man beside her? Let's find out. Madeline Harper's heels clicked sharply against the polished floor as she entered the first-class cabin of her American Airlines flight from New York to Los Angeles. She barely acknowledged the flight attendants, her mind preoccupied with the chaos of her day. A grueling series of board meetings, a flurry of emails, and an obligatory but tedious dinner with clients had drained her. All she wanted now was to sink into her seat, sip champagne, and endure the cross-country flight with minimal disruption. But as she approached her assigned seat, her heart sank. A man was already settled into the seat beside hers, a black man, casually dressed in jeans and a simple jacket. He was engrossed in a stack of papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. Madeline felt a wave of discomfort rise in her chest, one she tried to suppress but couldn't. She glanced around the cabin, searching for an alternative. But the other first-class seats were occupied. Her annoyance deepened as she turned to the flight attendant standing nearby. With an impatient wave of her hand, she summoned the young blonde woman, who approached with a professional smile that faltered as she sensed Madeline's irritation. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" the attendant asked, her tone laced with hesitation. Madeline folded her arms tightly. "Am I really supposed to sit here?" she asked, her voice low but dripping with disdain. The flight attendant blinked, her confusion evident. "I'm sorry, ma'am. What do you mean?" Madeline huffed, lowering her voice further, but making no effort to conceal her displeasure. "I'm not comfortable sitting here. Can't you move me somewhere else?" The flight attendant glanced at the man in question, who seemed completely unaware of the conversation. Her gaze flicked back to Madeline, and her expression stiffened as realization dawned. "I'm very sorry, ma'am, but the flight is fully booked. There aren't any available seats to move you to." Madeline's jaw tightened. "You must be joking. I paid thousands for this seat, and you're telling me I have to sit here next to—" She trailed off deliberately, her tone making it clear what she meant without saying it outright. The flight attendant's smile became strained. "All of our first-class passengers are valued equally. Ma'am, I assure you, you'll have a comfortable flight." Madeline narrowed her eyes, her frustration bubbling over. "Don't patronize me. I'm asking for a simple solution. Move me, now." "I understand your concern, ma'am," the attendant replied cautiously, "but there's truly nothing I can do. May I offer you a complimentary drink to make you more comfortable?" Madeline scoffed, her cheeks flushing. "A drink? Do you think that will solve the problem?" Nearby passengers began to glance in their direction, sensing the tension. Madeline's discomfort was palpable, but she wasn't about to back down. Her eyes darted to the man seated beside her. How could he sit there so calmly, ignoring the commotion she was making? Finally, as if sensing the weight of her glare, the man looked up. His expression was calm, his gaze steady. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice deep but measured. Madeline faltered momentarily, caught off guard by his directness. She opened her mouth to respond, but found herself flustered. I just don't see why I have to sit next to someone like me," the man finished, his tone even but his eyes sharp. Her face burned with anger and embarrassment. "That's not what I said." "You didn't have to," he replied simply, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. The flight attendant stood frozen, unsure of how to defuse the situation. The man turned back to her, his tone softening. "It's fine. There's no need for a scene. Let's all just get through the flight peacefully." Madeline bristled. How dare he act as though she was the one causing trouble? "I'm not making a scene," she hissed, though the quiver in her voice betrayed her indignation. "I just don't want to sit here." The man didn't respond, his attention already back on his papers. His calm demeanor only heightened Madeline's humiliation. The flight attendant, visibly uncomfortable, gave a tight nod and retreated down the aisle. Madeline dropped into her seat, her movements stiff and jerky. The first-class cabin, usually a space of comfort and exclusivity, now felt oppressive. Her cheeks burned as the earlier interaction replayed in her mind. She clenched her fists in her lap, furious not only with the situation, but with herself for losing control. The plane began to taxi, and the engines roared to life. As they ascended, Madeline tried to focus on anything other than the man beside her. But her mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of frustration and shame. How could he sit there so composed? As if her reaction hadn't even fazed him? The flight had barely begun, and yet Madeline already felt trapped by the confines of her seat, by the man beside her, and most of all, by the nagging realization that she might not be as in control as she thought. Madeline Harper sat in her first-class seat, her posture rigid, her jaw tight. The plane had barely lifted off, and already she felt suffocated, not by the space, but by the unresolved tension pressing down on her. Anthony Reynolds, the man sitting next to her, remained the picture of calm. He flipped through his stack of papers, his face neutral, his movements unhurried. It was as if the earlier interaction had never happened. Madeline couldn't stand it. She stole quick glances at him, hoping to catch a crack in his composure, a sign that he was just as unsettled as she was. But there was nothing, no anger, no irritation, no gloating, just an air of quiet confidence that made her own discomfort feel even heavier. Her mind replayed the interaction in torturous detail. The humiliation of being corrected in front of him. The cold finality of his words. You didn't have to say it. The way the flight attendant had looked at her with barely concealed disapproval. And the glances from the other passengers. She couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in the cabin had judged her. Madeline shifted in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her legs, fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. She tried to focus on the view outside the window. The dark expanse of the sky punctuated by tiny pinpricks of light. But every time Anthony turned a page, the soft rustle seemed to echo in her ears, reminding her of his steady presence. It felt like a subtle reminder of how calm he was, how utterly unaffected. Her annoyance grew. Doesn't he care at all? She thought. Doesn't he even want an apology? But then, why would he? He had handled the situation with grace while she had lost her composure. The realization stung. She hated feeling out of control, and Anthony's silence was an unbearable mirror reflecting her own flaws. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight attendants began their service, their quiet efficiency casting a calm over the passengers. Yet Madeline couldn't relax. She tried to distract herself, scrolling aimlessly on her phone, flipping through a magazine she wasn't actually reading, sipping her champagne with no enjoyment. Nothing worked. She glanced at Anthony again. He hadn't looked at her since their earlier exchange, hadn't offered so much as a sideways glance. It was as though she didn't exist. The thought was oddly infuriating. She was used to commanding attention, used to having her way. Now, beside a man who hadn't even raised his voice, she felt smaller than she ever had before. Anthony let out a quiet sigh as he finished reviewing his papers, neatly stacking them on the tray table. The sound, so ordinary, sent a strange wave of guilt through Madeline. He wasn't being difficult. He wasn't doing anything at all. Yet his calm presence magnified her internal turmoil. The realization struck her unexpectedly. Her anger wasn't really about him. It was about herself. She had been rude, dismissive, and judgmental. And now she was grappling with the weight of her actions. But even as she acknowledged it, pride kept her rooted in silence. Madeline closed her eyes, exhaling slowly as the flight settled into its routine. The quiet hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glasses filled the cabin. For the first time in a long time, she felt completely out of control, not because of Anthony Reynolds, but because of the parts of herself his calm had exposed. The flight stretched ahead, and Madeline felt every minute of it pressing down on her. The hours dragged on, but Madeline Harper's mind refused to settle. She had tried to busy herself with distractions, her phone, her drink, even staring out the window, but nothing worked. Her thoughts kept circling back to Anthony Reynolds, sitting quietly beside her, composed and unmoved. The memory of her earlier words gnawed at her. a nagging sense of guilt she couldn't shake. The cabin had grown quieter as the flight progressed. The lights dimmed to a soft glow. Passengers around her dozed or read, their focus far removed from the earlier scene. Madeline wished she could do the same, but every time she closed her eyes, the weight of her embarrassment surged back. A voice crackled over the intercom, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, his tone warm and upbeat. "We hope you're enjoying your flight. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a special guest on board tonight." Madeline's attention snapped to the announcement, curiosity momentarily replacing her discomfort. She glanced around, wondering which high-profile celebrity or influential figure was being recognized. "We are honored to have Mr. Anthony Reynolds, the owner and CEO of American Airlines, flying with us this evening. Mr. Reynolds, on behalf of the entire crew and staff, we'd like to thank you for your leadership and vision. It's a privilege to have you on board." Madeline froze. Her heart skipped a beat as the captain's words sank in. Anthony Reynolds, the man sitting beside her, the man she had dismissed so thoughtlessly. He wasn't just a passenger. He was the owner of the airline. She turned slowly toward him, her disbelief mirrored in her wide eyes. Anthony offered a polite nod to a flight attendant who had approached to acknowledge him, his expression calm and modest, as if this kind of recognition was a regular occurrence for him. Madeline's face burned with a mixture of shock and humiliation. She replayed the earlier scene in her mind, her dismissive tone, her demand to be moved, her refusal to sit next to someone like him. And now, here she was, realizing that the man she had judged so harshly not only belonged in first class but was, in fact, the reason first class existed at all on this flight. Her throat tightened as the weight of her actions settled over her. She glanced sideways at Anthony again, hoping to catch some sign of smugness or triumph on his face. There was none. He continued reading his papers, his demeanor as composed as it had been all evening. His restraint only made her humiliation worse. He wasn't going to call her out, wasn't going to humiliate her in return. He didn't need to. Her shame was punishment enough. Madeline sank back into her seat, the earlier tension replaced by a crushing sense of regret. She felt exposed, her earlier words and actions now glaringly clear in their pettiness. She thought about the way he had handled her outburst with dignity, with restraint, with a calm that now felt infinitely more powerful than anything she had said. The minutes ticked by, and the flight attendants resumed their duties, the captain's announcement fading into the background. Madeline struggled with the growing urge to say something, to apologize, to acknowledge how wrong she had been. But the words wouldn't come. What could she possibly say that would make up for the assumptions she had made, for the disrespect she had shown? Anthony turned a page in his papers, the sound soft but deafening in the quiet cabin. Madeline clenched her hands in her lap, forcing herself to take a deep breath. She couldn't let the flight end like this, couldn't carry the weight of her actions off the plane and into her life. Gathering her courage, she turned slightly toward him. Her voice was hesitant, quieter than she had intended. "Mr. Reynolds?" Anthony looked up from his papers, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Yes." Madeline swallowed, her pulse quickening. I wanted to apologize for earlier. I was out of line." Anthony studied her for a moment, his expression unchanged. Then he nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you for saying that." The simplicity of his response took her off guard. She had expected a longer reply, maybe even an admonishment, but there was nothing more. He returned to his papers, leaving her to sit with her thoughts. Madeline felt both relieved and unsettled. She had said the words, but she knew the apology was just the beginning. This wasn't about earning forgiveness from Anthony Reynolds. It was about confronting the parts of herself that had made the apology necessary in the first place. Madeline Harper sat quietly, her thoughts swirling with regret and self-awareness. Anthony Reynolds, the owner of American Airlines, had accepted her apology with calm simplicity, leaving her to wrestle with the weight of her actions. His silence spoke volumes, forcing her to confront the assumptions and biases that had shaped her behavior. She realized her discomfort had never been about him, but about her own preconceived notions. Watching Anthony interact with the flight staff, polite, composed, professional, only deepened her sense of shame. He carried himself with quiet confidence, while she had allowed her insecurities to dictate her actions. As the captain announced the descent into Los Angeles, Madeline's heart raced. The flight was ending, but her internal reckoning had just begun. She glanced at Anthony, knowing she couldn't let the journey end without making a final effort to address the man she had wronged. As the plane descended into Los Angeles, Madeline Harper felt a mix of anxiety and determination. The weight of her earlier behavior still lingered, but the clarity she had gained during the flight gave her the resolve to make things right. She turned toward Anthony Reynolds, who was tucking away his papers in a leather briefcase. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, her voice steady but quiet. Anthony glanced at her, his expression neutral but attentive. "Yes." Madeline swallowed her pride, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I wanted to apologize again for everything. I was wrong, and I let my assumptions get the better of me. You've shown more grace tonight than I deserved, and I'm truly sorry." Anthony paused, studying her for a moment. Then he nodded, his tone even. "I appreciate your apology." The simplicity of his response hit her harder than any lecture could have. It wasn't forgiveness she sought. It was the understanding that her actions reflected more about herself than anyone else. As the plane touched down, the cabin filled with the quiet bustle of passengers preparing to disembark. Madeline felt lighter, though she knew the journey ahead wasn't about erasing the night, but learning from it. When the plane came to a stop, Anthony stood, retrieving his briefcase from the overhead bin. Before he exited, he turned to her one last time. "Have a good evening, Miss Harper," he said, his tone polite but firm. "You too, Mr. Reynolds," Madeline replied, her voice softer. Watching him walk away, she knew she would carry this experience with her, not as a mark of shame, but as a reminder to do better. Madeline Harper, a woman used to control and privilege, had been humbled, and for the first time in a long time, she welcomed the opportunity to grow. Thank you for watching this eye-opening story on Empathy Stories. It's a reminder that grace and dignity can teach lessons that words alone cannot. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more compelling tales of humanity and personal growth. See you next time. And remember, kindness always leaves a lasting impact.